not equipped or trained to handle delivering mail. And literally in a matter of, I think it was 3.5 weeks, they settled the strike. And when they settled the strike, the company thought they would weed out all the troublemakers, including myself. So they sent me to the post office over at Rockefeller Center, where I worked until June of 1970. And then after Kent State happened, I pretty much couldn't stomach working for the federal government anymore. So I quit and thought I was going to pursue my music career, and started working different jobs down in Soho. And my first experience with unions outside of Grand Central was I worked at a picture frame factory. These are some of the shots showing now. This is a Vietnam Veterans Against the War. All during this period in New York, this 1970 to 1975 period, while I had day jobs, I fell in love first with the anti-war movement in New York City, and then with the labor movement. And here's a picture of me performing at a Vietnam Veterans Against the War march in July 4th, 1974, down in Washington, D.C., in front of 5,000 Vietnam veterans. Here's a shot performing at a May Day rally in 1975 in front of 2,000 people at Union Square, New York. So all this time I was doing my music, but at the same time, I was falling in love with the labor movement. And my first real experience with unions was in 1971. I was working for a picture frame factory down in New York City in the Soho area. And I was, this picture frame factory was pretty big. We framed pictures for the Museum of Modern Art and all the big museums uptown New York when they would have shows. And I was the only English-speaking white person that worked. The rest were mainly Latinos, a lot of Puerto Ricans, and a lot of immigrants from Guatemala, El Salvador, and South America, in particular Bolivia. And one day I was working, and the bosses came to the center of the floor, and they called all the workers there, and there was these two guys with suits on. They, quite frankly, looked like mobsters. I had never seen anybody before with a black shirt and a black tie and a black suit. And they called everybody together, and this guy got up, and there was about somewhere around 125, 150 of us worked there. And this guy got up and he announced, he says, from this point on, you're all in the Teamsters. And everybody was looking around because most of the Latinos, half of them didn't speak English, and most of them didn't have a clue who the Teamsters were. And so I looked and I saw the puzzlement on their face. So I raised my hand and I asked the guy, I said, what's this all about? And he looked at my boss and he looked at me and he went, shop steward right there. We like a guy that opens his mouth, and walked out. So when he left, I asked the owner, the boss, I says, what the hell is that all about? And he says, well, you're in a union. And I said, yeah, well, that's cool. But why? And he says, well, it's real simple. The Teamsters said if we don't put all you people, you workers in the union, there will be no supplies come in and out of here. So that was my introduction to unionism. And from there, in 1975, roughly around 1974, there was this organization called the Revolutionary Union who went around trying to recruit people into their organization. And they came to the place where our anti-war group existed, which also housed medical aid for Indochina and also the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And they asked me if I would go to, they knew I was from Kentucky, so they asked me, this was 1974, and for those of you who weren't around or weren't alive or weren't in the workforce, there was a huge, major recession in 1974, and the unemployment rate was over 10%. Is literally off the wall compared to the previous 20, 25 years. And so unemployment and unemployment insurance was a big issue. And they asked me, this group, to go to Louisville, Kentucky and organize the unemployed, specifically to get unemployment insurance extended beyond the normal 6-month period. So I went to Louisville, Kentucky. I got a job with American Standard, where they tried to fire me, but I beat them back, and had my second introduction to unionism down at American Standard, and also my initial introduction to industrial unionism. American Standard made urinals and made bathtubs, and it had a foundry and a cleaning house and an enamel shop, and it was full-scale heavy industrial production. And when I was down there, I was operating heavy equipment, including forklifts, Caterpillars, Bobcats, you name it. Worked the third shift, the midnight shift. The pay was shit. I was getting paid I think $5.38 an hour. And an old friend of mine from New York, radical buddy Mickey Jarvis, called me up, and he said, "What's going on?" I said, "I can't stand this place. I hate Louisville. I know why I left Kentucky. It's just," I says, I want to move back up to New York." He said, "Well," he says, "like they're taking applications at all these steel mills in Pittsburgh." He says, "And you can go up there and do the same thing you're doing and make 3 times as much money." So I went, "Oh, that sounds good." So I came up to Pittsburgh in 1977 and put an application in Homestead, Duquesne, and Irvin Works.
What was Pittsburgh like then? What were your first impressions of the whole sprawling monolith there?
It was like walking into an industrial fairy tale. It was like walking into something that I had only seen in books, that I had only seen in movies. There was smoke everywhere. There was smokestacks everywhere. The traffic was a snarl. Sometimes during the day, you would have orange dust, then you would have red dust, then you would have brown dust, then you would have gray dust. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. I'd never forget the first time I came into town and came across the high-level bridge and saw the Homestead Steel Mill when I applied for the job.
And we got a couple slides of that, I think. Oh, yeah.
That's pretty much right there what Homestead looked like when I came into it. And the mill was humongous. When I came to work there was somewhere around 7,000 people worked at the mill. It was considered one of the premier rolling mills in the United States, and everybody, I hope, knows a little bit about the history of Homestead, the 1892 strike. They led the charge, Homestead Steel Workers, during the 1930s organizing drives by the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, SWOC, and it was a very historical place, and it was a very traditional place, and it was so productive and so well known that in World War II, the U.S. government took the mill over under eminent domain and called it the National Defense Corporation. And the entire slab and plate division and open hearth number 5 and a number of other facilities were built during World War II by the U.S. government with taxpayer money. And if you go to the next slide, Jackie, the mill had 4 different entrances into it. These are only 3 of the entrances, I believe, but the mill was 4 miles long. It took up 300 acres in Homestead and ran all the way from the edge of West Homestead in the city of Pittsburgh, going east all the way up to Rankin, including Cary blast furnaces, which were across the street, across the river in Rankin. And we actually had 5 different unions at Homestead. 1397 was the biggest. We had 6,500 members. But the salaried local had their own Local 3063. The blast furnace workers had Local 1219. The plant protection had their own union. And, the medical workers had their own union. So there was a lot of little unions, but 1397 was the main union.
And as you point out in your book, all these people were being hired at the same time. The company, unbeknownst to most of everybody being hired, was actually making plans essentially to just close everything down in a few years. And is that the real deeper story you're trying to tell in the book about how this has really affected, that process has now actually affected our economy today?
When I went to work at Homestead, there was I had not an inkling of knowledge about this plant was going to shut down in a couple of years or start a process of shutdowns that basically took up the entire steel industry, but especially the Mon Valley. And when I went to work there and I got my job, I'll never forget, I had this burr-headed Marine, ex-Marine guy from management. When he gave us orientation, he told me, he says, all of us in orientation, there was about 15 of us, And he says, look, if you're here for a summer, if you're here for a part-time work, if you're here for a couple of years, I want you to hit the door right now. We're looking for lifers here. We're looking for people that want to make a lifetime commitment. And having worked 3 or 4 jobs over the last 5 years, I was like, oh my God, I'm in heaven. I got a full-time job that I could be here for the rest of my life. And I thought, with Homestead's reputation and with the everything that I knew about the area, I thought this mill was going to be here for a while. And when I got hired, the period from roughly around 1975 through 1970, early 1979, 1,000 people were hired into Homestead. And the majority of people that were hired in, first off, there was a consent decree that was the result of a lawsuit that was filed by African Americans at Homestead and the Fairfield Works down in Alabama. And basically the lawsuit said that there was major discrimination against African Americans and also women and any people of color, which there was like rampant discrimination even when I got to the mill. But finally the consent decree was settled in April, I think April 10th, 1974, and the company was ordered, U.S. Steel, under the consent decree, that half of the people that they hired had to be either women or minorities. So of the 1,000-some people that got hired into Homestead in this period in the 1970s, roughly about 500 of them were women or African Americans, and it was the first time since World War II that massive numbers of women entered the workforce. And the resentment amongst the older white workers was, you could touch it. It was like everywhere you went. The racism was everywhere you went. And some of the biggest battles were when the consent decree was signed, African Americans asserting their rights, their promotional rights, their hiring rights, their grievance rights, et cetera, et cetera.
So you saw this pretty much right away, even though you had not had a experience with that situation per se. What happened then? I mean, what was your take on this? Because
Well,
you had just been hired, you're a rookie, a fresh guy, but you saw this happening.
Well, I saw it happening, and the two things that struck me right away was the equipment and the machinery at Homestead was antiquated. It was literally from the 1940s and maybe at the latest the 1950s. It was very antiquated, and there was no talk of putting any new equipment in. The last piece of equipment they did put in, which you're seeing on the screen, was the result of a lawsuit that we filed in 1979 that our local union joined together with the Sierra Club and the Environmental Protection Agency and filed a lawsuit against U.S. Steel's polluting the air and the water. The lawsuit was settled in 1981 by U.S. Steel, and part of the lawsuit was they were going to put in a wastewater treatment facility, which you see in front of you. And the gantry crane that you see in front of you, which serviced the wastewater treatment facility, is still there. If you go into the Homestead Mall, the strip mall, and you make a left at Eaton Park, you'll see the gantry crane there. They left it up there as a relic. The wastewater treatment facility was torn down and, in fact, never, ever used one time. So U.S. Steel put this equipment in and never used it. And the other thing that happened is when I came in, it was really clear that right away there's literally a class war going on inside the mill. Management was nothing like I had experienced anywhere. They were feudalistic. They literally, you had individual fiefdoms in every department where management ruled the roost. They decided what was going to take place, what rights would be upheld and which rights wouldn't. And the union at that point, for whatever reason, through the years, had basically caved in and become an appendage of management. And when we came in the mill, the people that came in the mill, the African Americans, the women, the young white workers, who many Vietnam veterans came in. And so most of the workers that came in, the white workers, were either counterculture types like myself, or they were Vietnam veterans. And we weren't prone to taking any shit off of anybody. And we certainly weren't prone to somebody talking to us like they were a feudal lord. And that's the way U.S. Steel dealt with us. And so when people were filing grievances when I came in, grievances were basically, we had a 5-step grievance procedure. And it was very cumbersome. It took literally anywhere from 2 to 4 years if you got a case all the way through the grievance procedure to arbitration to get a case through. But at this stage, most of the grievances by the first or second step were thrown in the garbage can by the union. My first grievance I filed was in 1978. Had a grievance guy named Scotty, and I took my goggles off, and the boss gave me a slip, and a disciplinary slip. And when I took the slip to Scotty, said, I want to fight this. I want to file a grievance. He looked at me, handed the slip back to me. He says, if I was you, I'd keep your nose clean and shut your mouth. And that's the reality that we young workers confronted when we came into the mill. And at the same time that was happening, there was a major rank and file movement, insurgency, that had already been mounted several years earlier by 3 people in the mill. And 2 of them were located in the Central Maintenance Department. Ron Wiesen, who is a welder, who by that time had over 20 years in the mill. John Ingersoll, who is a rigger, had over 20 years in the mill there, but also he had a whole bunch of years over at National Works and was actually a grievance rep over there. And then the person that really got the whole movement, rank and file movement, off the ground was Michelle McMills. And Michelle was a 24-year-old young woman who came into a steelworker, white man's world and turned the entire local union upside down. And she was the one that surmised. She went to, got together with Ingersoll and Wiesen at a union meeting, and they decided to form a group and call it the 1397 Rank and File. And the rank and file name was based on a national movement that had begun and basically took place in 1976 when a steelworker from District 31 up in Gary, Indiana, named Ed Sadlowski ran for international president. And he ran on a very radical program, a pro-democracy program to democratize the union, to give us the right to vote. We did not even have the right to vote on our own contract. Our contracts were voted on by local union presidents, not by the membership. So he ran on a right to ratify. We have a right to ratify our own contract, to revamp our grievance procedure, to streamline it, and to democratize our union. And he lost the election in February 1977, but he won Basic Steel 3-2, including the Homestead Local. And off of that movement and that election campaign, Michelle and John Ingersoll and Ron Wiesen formed the 1397 Rank and File. They ran for office and got elected to go to the their first convention in 1976. So in 1977, they came back and formed the Rank and File movement. Then when they came back in 1977, they probably, a bunch of people joined the rank and file, people that were having trouble getting grievances filed, people that were friends or co-workers of theirs in central maintenance. And what happened in 1977 was the company decided that they had done an overpayment to central maintenance workers. And the overpayment was like, it was like a $380,000. Which back then, if you divided that up by central maintenance workers, it was a big chunk of change. So the union, the workers who were told their money was going to be deducted from their pay, went to file a grievance. The local union officers refused to entertain the grievance, told them to go home, shut up. Their grievance would get nowhere. But what the rank and file did was they went to District Director Paul Lewis, and they fought the grievance themselves without the local union. To his credit, Paul Lewis at the time took up the battle, hired an outside lawyer that worked with Frank Lucchino, who some people might be familiar with in Pittsburgh, and they actually took the case, bypassed the grievance procedure, and took it to court and won the case by January 1978. When the rank and file won that case, the caucus exploded, and people not only from central maintenance joined during this period in late 77, early 78, All sorts of people joined the rank and file, and they're all in the book. But some of the most notable people were my good friend and future chairman of the Grievance Committee, John O'Toole, Tommy Jugan from OH4, Ronnie Manula, Paul Glunt, all sorts of people jumped on. And then at the same time that happened in 1978, once that victory was won, people from other mills, and when I say other mills, I mean at the Homestead Works, because within the Homestead Works, you literally had 5 or 6 steel mills inside one mill. And we had a slab and plate division, which was 2,000 workers worked in the slab and plate division. We had the 45-inch slab mill, the 160-inch plate mill, and the 100-inch plate mill. Workers from the slab and plate mill, from the forge division, which produced a lot of nuclear equipment, from the structural division, which produced the steel for all the skyscrapers and the bridges in the United States. Anywhere you go in the United States, you're going to see Homestead Steel Workers everywhere, because that steel, for the Golden Gate Bridge out west, to the Verrazanos Bridge in New York, to the George Washington Bridge, to the Empire State Building, the Alcoa Building, all that steel came from Homestead. They should have had bricks on those steels.
And these people are celebrated. I think we have a song coming up, Heroes of History. You wrote the song about those folks.
Yeah, this song is about not just the people at Homestead, but the people in the steelworkers movement that were fighting for union democracy from Youngstown all through the Mon Valley. And one of the reasons I did this song was to honor those people whose name never get mentioned in the history books.
Writers and singers whose work is done for somebody else's will. Oh, you're behind the scenes. Faceless in the dark, you're lost in insanity. I'll use every means to show the world the mark that you made in our history. Here's to all the people who stand up and speak for what is right. You in the face of fear and state violence, shine like a beacon light. I'll toot your horn for you. Stake a claim in some private brilliant history. I'll give credit where it's due, and I'll show where you belong under the chains of our history. Here's to all the freedom fighters who love the best in blood. These deeds and contributions are buried in every nation's blood. I'll drink a toast to you, celebrate the love and the life you give to me. I'll brag the boast for you, and shall tell the stories of heroes of our history. Here's to the Homestead Steel Mill, 1397 ranking. Solidarity and struggle you waged, no fleeting was so worth. I remember you, put you on the books for all the eyes to see. I'll sing the song for you, and I'll tell the world the part that you play in our history. You're the real heroes of history.
Mike Stout, Heroes of History. Mike, one question, 6 words. Why did you write this book?
I wrote this song for all the people that made history in the Mon Valley and Youngstown, and that the struggle in the steel industry to democratize the union and to fight the plant shutdowns that were coming down at the beginning in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I'm a firm believer that it ain't intellectuals and it's not leaders that make history, it's the masses that make history. It's ordinary people, and most of the ideas leaders get come from the bottom, and I wanted those people recognized.
What other insights do you think Union Local 1397 had during these last 10 years?
The rank and file movement came about because there was a lack of democracy in our union, and because we were confronted with a labor relations situation that was untenable. It was unbearable, as it had been for decades. And the rank and file movement started with a couple, handful of people, and by 1978, the writing was on the wall. We took the entire slate to the USWA convention in 1978 in Atlantic City. In 1979, we swept into office and took every position except for 3 grievance positions. When we took, you can start showing the slides there, Jackie. When we took office, it was, first thing we did was we told the International Union that we were going to fight our own grievances all the way to arbitration. We completely revamped the grievance procedure. So the reasons for the movement at Homestead, and the reasons I wrote this book was there's 3 or 4 major reasons. Number one, I think we're confronted with the issue of, do we need unions? And if we do need unions, what should they look like? And we think that, and I thought, and the rank and file thought, that we not only need unions, but we need democratic unions. And these pictures you're seeing now are when they shut the Youngstown steel mills down, 3 mills in Youngstown, and eliminated 10,000 people. The workers rose up and they took over the U.S. Steel building in Youngstown on January 28, 1980, and held the building for an entire day. And in hindsight, they should have never left. And there was probably a half dozen workers from Homestead joined them, including a 160-inch mill worker, Kathy Kozachenko, who got hired in early 1979. This was a cartoon in our newspaper when the International Union walked away from the Youngstown steelworkers and their struggle to save those mills. And basically, those of us who went to Youngstown, the first picture you saw was Michelle and I at a demonstration in Youngstown. And what we learned from Youngstown was that the winds, the shutdown winds in Youngstown were blowing toward the Mon Valley. And so we came back, Michelle, Ronnie, myself, and Joe Stanton, and a number of people, and we decided to form a tri-state conference on steel based in Pittsburgh, which was a community church labor alliance. And essentially, what we said that the tri-state conference was, one, not only did we oppose the shutdowns, but two, we've got to find alternatives to keep the mills operating. We've got to find new forms of ownership. We've got to form new labor relations, modernize the mills, and find a whole new way of operating. So the Tri-State Conference set on its path. And one of the things that the rank and file movement that was special about it is we always had an inside-outside strategy. We always were fighting inside the mill. We fought the bosses day to day. We fought them every hour of every day. And secondly, we fought them on the outside. We were in the streets demonstrating. The upper right-hand corner is when we took over the US Steel building on November 30th, 1979, with 400 steel workers from Youngstown and 200 from the Mon Valley. We took over the first 2 floors of the US Steel building. And when we decided to go up and occupy Roderick's offices up on the top floor, they had to shut the elevators down and shut the electricity off for the entire building. And in hindsight, we should have never left. We should have stayed there and made them drag us out kicking and screaming. The picture on the left and on the bottom right are 2 of probably dozens and dozens of demonstrations we had during the years 1979 through 1986. There wasn't hardly a week goes by we weren't demonstrating in the streets and bringing the public's attention to what was going on inside the steel mills themselves, but also with the steel industry in general. We filed lawsuits. At the same time we were demonstrating in the streets, we were fighting grievances. Anytime they violated the law or violated our rights and it couldn't be dealt with within the context of the union contract, we filed lawsuits against them. When they said they were going to shut our mills down and open up a mill in Conneaut, we filed a lawsuit. We stopped it. When they refused to clean the air and water up, like I said before, we hooked up with environmental groups and filed a lawsuit against the company and forced them to agree in writing to modernize the Homestead Steel Mill and put in that wastewater treatment facility, which they did, but they never, ever implemented it.
Besides the grievances and finally taking them seriously, which your job as grievance man, you finally got those going. What other ways were you able to get the real rank and file? You probably were incredibly cynical by this point. To really embrace the sort of philosophy you were bringing.
One of the things that Ronnie Wiesen and John Ingersoll and John O'Toole and Michelle McMills did when we took over our local in April 1979. There was fallout. I mean, there was different factions. There was the normal ego stuff that goes on. The racism still existed. The discrimination against women still existed. But we had a strong union movement inside Homestead. We formed a women's committee that was one of the most active in the Valley. We had one of the most active civil rights committees in the Valley. And just as important, we believed in coalitions. We believed that the fate of steelworkers inside the mill was determined by forces outside. The picture you see there is the slab and plate office building, which back in the day literally was right underneath the high-level bridge, just to the west of Eaton Park. That is where I fought all my grievances from 1979 to 1986, when the mills were completely shut down. I was put on as an assistant grievance man in 1979. I got laid off in 1980. This is when I came back to work in April 1981, I got a bid at the 160-inch plate mill. And that's the rolling mill where I worked in on the night shift. I snuck in a camera and got a few pictures, which of course was illegal. But I got them anyway just to for keepsake. I then went, what happened in 1981 was the zone grievance man, Nat King, got cancer and died literally within weeks. And a whole battle ensued over who was going to be the zone grievance man, which was an elected position. There was literally 24 people were pissing in Ronnie's ears, Ronnie Wiesen, to get the job. And John O'Toole intervened at that point and told Ronnie, he says, put Mike on. He's a fighter. He does his homework, and he's got the energy, put him on. So with John O'Toole's intervention and Ronnie, they put me on as zone grievance man. In April 1981. In May, there was an election. Literally within 1 month, I had basically had a reputation with the workers in the mill that it didn't matter who you were, didn't matter what color you were, what gender you were, how much seniority you had, I was going to fight for you. In fact, the people that didn't like me, the people that were jealous of me, the people that resented me, I wanted to fight for them twice as hard, because I wanted to show them that what the union was all about was not the personalities, but representing and involving the members. One of the biggest issues in the mill was the issue of safety and health. The company had a disciplinary procedure, which basically they used to beat the union and beat the union membership into place. And what they would do is they would use the safety and health procedure to basically give discipline to workers. And you started out with a warning, then you got 1 day off, then 2 days off, then 3 days off, then 4 days off, and then you were fired. And literally, if the boss didn't like you, it could be a matter of weeks, and you would be up to a 4 or 5 day slip. So most of the grievances that John O'Toole and myself and the other grievance reps fought in those early days, 1979, 78, 79, 80, were disciplinary slips. You know, people that were getting disciplined and people that were getting discharged illegally. So John O'Toole, when he came in, Ronnie Wiesen went to a meeting with the company, a third step grievance meeting, and announced to the company and the international that John O'Toole was going to handle our cases in arbitration, and the company and the international can take a hike, and they did. And so John O'Toole began handling his own cases. When I was put on as zone grievance man, I started handling my own cases in 1981. And I wasn't a hotshot lawyer. What I knew and what I learned was the way to win grievances was the same way you did everything else, was you involved the membership in the fight. And the secret to winning grievances was getting the members who were grieving and getting their fellow workers involved in the fight.
And the rank and file newspaper, people still read newspapers back then, and that turned out to be just the most incredible sort of organizing force, I guess.
The rank and file newspaper probably, in my opinion, was the most important thing that came out of the rank and file movement at Homestead. It was the brainchild of Michelle McMills, who is in that picture in the center there, the only woman in that picture. This is the first issue of the rank and file newspaper that she put out in 1977. And what Michelle did was she looked at the mill being 4 miles long, having 4 entrances, you know, a bunch of mills within a mills. And she said, well, the only way we're going to get people to speak with one voice, and the only way we're going to give people a voice, is to start a newspaper. So she started the newspaper with Ronnie and John Ingersoll, and Michelle did all the layout. We didn't have typesetting back then. We didn't have computers. You did everything by hand. You letter, pressed every single letter in the headlines up there. All the type was typed by a typewriter, Selectric 2 typewriter, IBM. And Michelle put the whole newsletter together. And Ronnie started a section in the newsletter called the Plant Plague. And the Plant Plague allowed any member of the union to say whatever they wanted. And basically it gave the workers a voice to express their frustration, whether it was with the grievance procedure in the company or with any number of issues. And the beauty of the newspaper was it unleashed a cultural revolution, at the same time an economic union revolution. And literally the newspaper was filled with poems, with poetry, with songs, with cartoons, with anybody could write an article. And we had 4 different cartoonists who put the cartoons in there. And basically the newspaper expressed the voice of the rank and file, and anybody was allowed to put an article in the newspaper that wanted. And our rule was, if you got witnesses and we can't get sued, you can put the, here's a good, on the left hand there, and also the far right is Jim Brown. He was the contract administrator for Slab and Plate, and he ruled the roost in Slab and Plate till I got there. And then when I got there, I told him his backroom deals were done. And they attempted to fire an African-American worker named Kenny Williams, and I crushed him and took the case to third step, and Kenny was back to work. And Jim Brown saw the writing on the wall that he now was in for a fight, so he retired. So I gave him a nice sending off party there with his retirement in the newspaper. But we had, the bosses always had their cartoons in the newspaper. So
you got a newspaper that is really starting to give workers a voice and connecting them. But you also at the same time started collaborating with other agencies in the community. And this became very important when it was obvious that the mill was shutting down and workers really needed help. What were some of those activities?
Well, the newspaper not only dealt with in-plant stuff, but it dealt with stuff like, here's the grievance procedure, different issues like, you know, job cutting was going on at the time, where the company basically was on a, they would like say they were going to cut a job, and they would have 25 bosses sitting around watching a crew work, which is what that cartoon is up on the left-hand corner. Down in the right-hand corner, when they were forced with a consent decree to modernize the mill in May 1981, which I still have the document in writing, signed by Roderick, they opted to buy Marathon Oil on November 4th, 1981 for $6.4 billion and abandon all of their promises to modernize the mill. And so what we did was the Tri-State Conference mounted a campaign in the community to organize the community, not only to fight the shutdowns, but to find alternatives to keep the mills open. And one of the alternatives we came up with was the idea of the Steel Valley Authority and using eminent domain to turn the guns around and basically tell the company, if you're not going to run the mill, then we'll give you your fair market value. You can hit the road and we'll take the mill over and run it ourselves.
And you had some campaigns about, well, it all comes down to, you know, follow the money. Mellon Bank.
The pictures you're seeing up there now, just real quickly on the upper left-hand corner, we started a campaign against Ronnie and I and John O'Toole against working overtime to keep from bringing laid-off workers back, and the company had sent a letter out, which is up the upper left-hand corner, saying that telling management how to skirt the overtime sections of the contract. So we basically told people not to work overtime, why they shouldn't, and how they could get around doing it. The bottom right-hand picture there is we had a section in the newspaper called The Dumbest Foreman in the Mill. And we had a contest every time the paper came out. Workers submitted who the dumbest foreman was in their department and why they were wanted him to win the contest as dumbest foreman. And the actual winner ended up being a guy from OH5 named Maravich, who was notorious for firing and harassing workers. And what happened is he was a gambler and he was in debt, so he decided to burn his own house down to and blame it on the union to basically pay his gambling debts off, and then at the same time kill two birds with one stone and get back at the union. So I did an article. We named him the dumbest foreman of the year, and he sued the newspaper, and we formed an alliance with Aetna Life Insurance and kicked his ass, and the suit got thrown out. So the newspaper served, here's the dumbest foreman in the article, which, by the way, that's in the book if you want to read the article about Maravich. But we constantly, management could do nothing, get away with nothing that wasn't exposed in the newspaper. And the newspaper became a voice not only for the workers inside the mill, but outside. When the Tri-State Conference on Steel then spent a period from 1979 through 1984 attempting to get the workers in the area to understand the need to set up our own industrial authority, and also to basically find alternatives to the plant shutdowns. So this picture up here was the Tri-State got a call from the local union up at Crucible Steel in Midland and Hines and Specter, the two senators from Pennsylvania, were speaking at the time. So when they went up there to speak, Crucible invited us, so the Tri-State sent me up there. And when I spoke, after Hines and Specter, who said our problems were all because of foreign imports, I basically got up in front of 500 people and said, no, our import problem is 600 Grant Street. U.S. Steel is the one that's importing steel into the United States. They're the ones that are the problem, not foreign steel companies. U.S. Steel's the major importer and the problem. Well, the crowd went completely berserk, and Hines and Specter were forced to do an investigation of the steel that U.S. Steel was importing. And time after time, we formed alliances, not just around the steel industry, but with a number of organizations, outfits out there. One of the most notable was the Thomas Merton Center. We formed coalitions with them through Molly Rush and a number of other people. Charlie McCullough, who was the grievance chair, which was chief steward at the Union Switch and Signal plant in Swissvale, but he was a member of the Thomas Merton Center, and Molly Rush, who was one of the co-founders. We hosted a Polish Solidarity salute and gave Polish Solidarity the New Persons Award in 1982 and held the event at the 1397 Union Hall. In fact, our Union Hall became the movement center, not just for steelworkers, but for other organizations in the area. The Merton Center also brought in the issue of war and the issue of imperialism. And we had a number of hearings at 1397 around the U.S. Support for the dictatorships in El Salvador and Nicaragua, and alerted workers to that. These pictures up here are about the food bank. And when the layoffs started in 1980, 200 workers were laid off in 1980 at the end, but the big layoff came in September. On September 13th, 1981, we called it our Black Friday. 1,800 steel workers at Homestead alone were laid off. When they were laid off, we had formed an unemployed committee in 1980, which another woman steel worker, Lynn Morton, who has slipped through the cracks, nobody ever mentions her name. She was the motor force that got the unemployed committee started. When the unemployed committee started, dozens of workers who had never been involved in the local got involved, and a bunch of us were having a party over at the Wargos, Mike Wargo, who worked in the slab yard. And some of the people at the party were Jay Weinberg and Artie Leibowitz and Jerry Lachek. And late night in the party, we were confronted with all these layoffs and people's unemployment was going to run out in a couple months. I raised the issue. I said, well, what, based on what happened in the 1930s, the fight don't starve. I said, we should start a food bank. And everybody, oh, that's a good idea. And I said, well, how are we going to pay for it? Well, Artie Leibowitz, one of the only 4 Jewish people that worked in the mill and one of the most active, heroic people who ended up organizing the not only the unemployed but homeless people for years after the mill shut down. Artie said, well, let's have a rock concert. And so sure enough, on April 14, 1982, we had a rock concert that Joe Gruszecki and the House Rockers and the Granati Brothers and a black band called Rare Experience and also the Billy Price Blues Band. We had a benefit at the Stanley Theater. 3,000 people attended. We raised $12,000 and got our food bank off the ground. The picture on the left and the picture on the bottom right are 2 of our first distributions. By October 1982, we were feeding 1,200 people two times a month, and we were giving them 2 to 3 bags of groceries. At the same time, our food bank was going, the Mon Valley Unemployed Committee, which was an offshoot of the Tri-State Conference on Steel, started a food bank to service the other locals in the Valley. So we had 2 huge food banks going. At the same time, demonstrations started taking place almost weekly in the Mon Valley. And mainly were organized by the Mon Valley Unemployed Committee. Barney Ausler, Steffi Domike, Bob Anderson, Paul Ledico, Rob Toy. They were mainly workers from Duquesne, National Works, ET, and Irvin, doing the same thing we were doing at Homestead, but in the other mills. The difference from their food bank and their activities and ours was we had the support of the local union leadership. They didn't. and they had to do everything themselves. So my hat goes off to them.
You have a song you wrote about a real dear friend, Frankie McCullough.
Frank, the Steelworkers Union, Local 1397, was a fighting local. We were a local of people who not only knew that we needed to change things inside the union, but change things outside. We mounted unbelievable campaigns, including a campaign against Mellon Bank when they refused to give MESTA workers their back pay. And also we found out that Mellon was financing steel mills in South America and other places. So we started a disinvestment campaign with Mellon Bank. And we basically went in our local union and withdrew our money from Mellon and started a stampede on Mellon Bank. And one of the people that was heavily involved in that campaign was my friend who passed away in 2011, Frank McCullough. And Frank was a special steel worker. He was one of our 4 artists, and he was also a fighter. He was a drinker. He was a writer, and he took shit off of no one. And he worked in the department I worked in the 160, and we became good friends. And no matter what kind of squabbles and ego differences were going on in the local, Frank stuck and was friends and a fighter in the local with everybody. And this song is not just about Frank, but it's about all the Homestead Steel Workers at Local 1397. We had secretaries at the locals, Cheryl Bacco McCartland, Darlene McIntosh Deffenbaugh. We had women food bank workers who you saw a picture of earlier, and we had workers, whether it was around civil rights, the unemployment committee, the food bank, hundreds of steel workers that were active in 1397. And Ronnie Wiesen and John O'Toole in the local union created the vehicle to allow those people to get active. And that was the secret to our local. Not any heroes, not any one person, but all of us working together as a team. And this song is a salute to the 1397 rank and file.
Leader of the rank and file down at Homestead Mill. Got a heart of gold, a spirit bold, oh, that stainless steel. Voice for the ones who could not speak, champ for the underdog. Writer, drinker, working class thinker, trying to right what's wrong. The Union soldier in a holy war, save a manufacturing base. Back in the years when good jobs were here, heroes had their place. He believed in the Democratic Union. For the members, he took a stand against the powers that be, in solidarity for the working women and men. Ronnie and Johnny and Tommy Michelle, Jack Dave and the rest of the gang turned the local around, upside down, hills of freedom rang. So ego and power stole the hour, showers of shutdowns rain. Frankie still shining on the front lines, fighting all the way to the end. And when our movement split, some tried to force me to quit, well, Frankie refused to take sides. At every bend, he stayed my friend. This memory will never die. Just like we was true blood brothers, we had each other's back. 3 decades later, our friendship greater, that bond did never crack. I saw Frankie's name buried on the obit page. Another cancer victim that big city killed way too young in age. In the funeral den with his family and friends, told them about the days. In the labor wars, on the shop floor, love and passion reigns. Among the ranks, taking on the big banks, Frankie Domagala stood up against the clowns who tore the mills down, giving it all he could. He believed in democracy and justice. Courage ran through his veins. Like the others he fought, and history forgot, I'll make sure they remember his name. Frankie was the leader of the rank and file, born in the side of the beast. He had a heart of gold and a hero's soul, a spirit that will never cease. He had a heart of gold and a hero's soul, may his body rest in peace.
Take some Q&A now, some questions. I know folks have some. Put them in the chat. Our studio assistants will bring them to us. While we're getting ready for that and your questions and Mike's answers, just want to note that his book, incidentally, is published by PM Press of Oakland, California, a really major social movement kind of publisher that really has books on all sorts of labor and political history. And they're giving a 40% discount. Not just tonight only, but probably for a few days to come. Go to pmpress.org and use the coupon code Homestead, HOMESTEAD. So go to pmpress.org. You will get 40% off both ebook and the hard copy edition of Homestead Steel Mill, The Final 10 Years by Mike Stout. I guess we'll wait for questions a little bit, but just basically, what is the role of a union today, Mike?
I think the role of the union, one, is to do everything they can to involve their membership in the union. Only by democratizing the unions, which that's what involving them means, giving them a voice, giving them a place, a seat at the table, whether it's at the local union or above. And I think that, along with the unions, have got to understand, and this is what we learned at 1397, 30 years ago, is unions will never survive in this world without coalescing with other forces and around other issues, be it the environment, be it Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the immigration issue. Unions have got to not only unite with those struggles and those movements, but they've got to involve their membership to do it. It doesn't do any good if a couple officials at the top are involved with those organizations or just a couple of staff. The unions have got to unleash their membership. And the reason being, if they don't, the companies and the capitalist system is going to crush them. They're out to destroy, to tear unions down, to take their rights away, the same way they're attacking African Americans, the same way they're attacking women and immigrants. These movements have got to come together, and they've got to stand together, and we've got to have our own independent political voice.
Yeah, people don't often realize that I think collective bargaining, the right to collectively bargain in America, it really wasn't until 1935, I think Francis Perkins, it actually became law. You did actually have the legal right to unionize and collectively bargain. And that has, over the years, been taken away Republican state legislature by state legislature. It just seems one of the things they're eroding. Oh, we have a question. Discount code, again, is Homestead, just like the town and just like the mill and just like the famous 1892 strike, Homestead. So Mike, if you were to walk into Stein's Bar at 6th and Amity in 1980, and a 2020 version of yourself stepped in there and you saw your 1980 Mike Stout self, what would you tell 1980 Mike Stout to be looking for around the bend?
Quite honestly, I wouldn't tell him anything different than I was telling in 1980. I would say it's time to stand up and fight for your rights. It's time to go out and get organized. It's time for the bottom to rise to the top. And it's time for workers to stand up and assert themselves because we are the ones that made everything in this country, and we're the ones that will decide whether or not it goes forward or goes backwards. And my message is the same today as it was 35, 40 years ago, and it's been the same message. We need an independent voice, political voice. We need a movement that's in the streets, a movement that's in the workplace, a movement that's in the courts, and a movement that's in the political system. And we need to stand up, and we need to take back this country from the powers that be.
Yeah. And although we have all this great technology that is helping us organize, you know, even this Zoom that we're on tonight, at the same time, so much disinformation can be spread against unions and against even the principle of working together. And that's nothing you got to fight against.
It's impossible in an hour and a half to talk about. I could sit here for an hour and a half and talk about one day in the class struggle inside the steel mill. One day, and I couldn't get through one day in an hour and a half.
That's your next book?
You need to read the book. The book gives some detailed fights inside and outside the mill over a 7-year, 8-year period. And I think that'll give you a little bit of flavor of the type of fights we had to wage. But if you want to see and read about and see pictures about class struggle up front and personal inside a steel mill, you need to read this book.
Read this book. We have a question. In Local 1397, you came together. To what degree did being in Story to Homestead, and we mentioned the 1892 strike before, not Rankin or Duquesne, but specifically Homestead, inspire you?
I don't know how to explain this because I've never been, much of a religious person in my life. But when I entered in the Homestead Steel Mill, and especially when I entered into my first union meeting, I could feel something in the air. I could feel a spirit in the air that I had never felt anywhere else. The workers down to the shop floor level didn't take shit off anybody. They fought for their rights. Whether it was within the confines of the contract or outside the confines of the contract, the fight took place. And it was that spirit, I think, that made Homestead special. And that spirit, I think, is something that evolved over a 100-year period. And those people who are historians, who are all, familiar with the 1892 strike and the 1919 strike, which Homestead played a big part in, and the 1930s, the steelworkers organizing drives, is that spirit that I was introduced and fell in my lap when I entered the Homestead Mill. I could feel it, I could see it every single day I was in that mill.
That's the kind of legacy that's really important to pass on, because so many younger people just are not going to have that experience.
I think everybody's got that experience in their hearts. They got to find it. And that experience is reaching out to your fellow workers, your brothers and sisters that are going through the same thing you're going. Until we have that kind of, and you need to read the end of my book and the last chapter. I talk about, these issues of coalitions and these issues of democratizing the union and so on and so forth. But you've got to have that fighting spirit. You've got to have an understanding of the old IWW slogans that an injury to one is an injury to all, that we are all in the same boat, and if everybody doesn't row, the boat don't go. Until you have that kind of a spirit and that kind of outlook, I said nothing's going to change, because there ain't no way anybody out there is going to beat this thing individually. We're up against an entire capitalist system that is out to drive workers into the ground, and workers have got to start coalescing with other workers, not just at their workplace, but throughout the area and throughout the region, and coalesce with other forces in society that are trying to take on, whether it's the environmental issue or the police brutality issue or what have you. We've all got to form one political movement, and we've got to stand up with one voice. Until we do that, the bloodletting is going to continue.
Well, I think the whole concept here that the system runs on is disposability. Workers are disposable, trees are disposable, water is disposable, air, healthcare is disposable. Doesn't matter, it can be as insufficient as possible, because essentially the consideration is that humans in their workplace especially are just disposable. And that really, I think, is the heart. If people stop believing that, then things will really change. But right now, too many people are believing that they're disposable, and they'll go along with that.
Well, and the other thing too is there's a lot of stories in the book that I was confronted with, how you deal with power. and everybody knows what power is. Power is when you can make decisions that affect other people's lives. And having power and how to deal with power and not let it go to your head, and certainly not let it go to your heart, was an extremely important experience I had. And some of those experiences are laid out pretty clearly in the book, and I encourage people to read them.
We've got a great question here. What, in your opinion, is the most powerful and longest lasting example of community labor alliance?
I think the fight to save the Mon Valley and form the Steel Valley Authority, and also the Youngstown fight to save their mills. We took over the U.S. Steel buildings in Pittsburgh and Youngstown. We had a coalition that was in the hundreds, if not thousands, trying to save the Dorothy 6 mill, trying to save the Southside electric furnaces, and trying to save the plate mill and machine shop at Homestead and the Youngstown workers. Those struggles that involved not only ordinary workers, they weren't led by international union officials, they were led by local union activists, local union officials like John Barbero and Ed Mann in Youngstown, Ronnie Wiesen and Michelle McMills, and people like Lenny Stovall and Jim Benn and Barney Ausler, and people that in mills that didn't have power. They weren't even in office. Those are the people, and those are the types of movements I think that need not only to be remembered in history, but need to be duplicated.
And are you seeing that anywhere now?
Yes.
Maybe generally, or even just this area as well?
I think that I'm seeing the beginnings of it. I'm seeing the continuing of it, but I think we need to ratchet it up. I think the Steelworkers Union, I was a member of the Steelworkers Union for 36 years, dues paying steelworker. I was a musicians union member for 23 years. I was a member of the IWW. I actually paid dues to 3 unions at the same time. And I think the Steelworkers Union right now, along with the United Electrical Workers Union and the UE, which is headquartered in Pittsburgh, is probably, in my opinion, the most progressive, rank and file based Democratic union in the country. And the UE understands the need for a Green New Deal. The UE understands the need to involve the community and unite workers. And I think the Steelworkers Union is in a strong position to unite various forces in the environmental and other movements in the Pittsburgh area, because steelworkers represent workers in the renewable energy as well as the gas and oil industry. And the steelworkers, in my opinion, have hired some of the best young, progressive organizers anywhere I've seen in the country, and are perfectly suited to going out and coalescing with other forces and other unions. And I think they need to form an alliance with the United Electrical Workers, and they need to form alliances with the community, and they need to start getting out into the streets and letting this system and letting these owners of these facilities know we're not going to stand by and let you crush us again.
We're going to have one more song that Mike will introduce, but I do want to say that this has been a terrific evening. Really want to thank Mike for being here. Thank him for writing the book and keeping all these cartoons and all, just everything. You must have had file boxes of all this and to be able to pass along. Now we have some folks to thank briefly.
I would thank some too.
Yeah, Jackie Cavalier and Jason Kendall for the excellent use of their home broadcast studio. Nathan Ruggles for doing the chat monitor. John Hare, who's the Battle of Homestead Foundation president. Suzanne Donsky, who is our current program committee chair and has helped guide this process of all our programs this year long. Jerry Fitzgibbon, who puts out these e-blasts that you get, and that's a powerful tool. Maybe our own rank and file, medium source for now, and so many more. You'll be getting a short online survey that literally takes just 2 minutes. You can even read it backwards and it would still just take 2 minutes. You're going to be getting that survey after this is over, maybe later tonight. And please, we really do appreciate your feedback on this. Whatever else you might think about other programs we should have in the future. And again, for more information about everything the Battle of Homestead Foundation does, please visit our website at battleofhomestead.org. You can become a member and join us in these other programs. It'll be fun. Mike, you want to introduce this last song?
I just want to extend a special thanks to a number of people out there who this book would have never happened without them, and I would have never ever been a grievance man and accomplished what little we did accomplish at Homestead without them. Number one, John O'Toole, who was the grievance chair when I came on as a grievance committeeman for Slab and Plate, and Ronnie Wiesen, who brought me on as a zone grievance man. None of anything that I did accomplish would have never happened if they wouldn't open the door and supported me and supported the rank and file getting involved, whether it was in the grievance procedure or the food bank or the unemployed committee or whatever. My hat goes off to them and their families, especially Ronnie's family. Ronnie passed away in 1998. My hat goes off to all the steelworkers in the rank and file caucus. Some of them are on the air here. I think John O'Toole's on. I think Cal Shookman, Craneman down in the 100-inch. Jerry Fitzgibbons worked at Homestead. The Homestead rank and file steelworkers, many who stayed on their own dime when the plant was shut down and they ran out of unemployment. John Deffenbaugh, Cheryl Bacco McGartland, our secretary, worked 5 days a week for 1 day's pay. There ain't no finer union women in the world than Cheryl and Darlene at the Union Hall. And some of the women who formed the food bank and worked on that, like Maureen Trout and Barb Weibelt and Sue Harricle, all those women, the food bank would have never happened without you. And lastly, I'd like to thank the people that made me get off my ass and write this book. Number one, Stoughton Lynn and Alice Lind in Youngstown, with their encouragement and guidance. Charlie McAllister, who we started writing a book on Tri-State, and he diverted to his memoirs and said, well, Mike, just write your book about 1397. And without his push, I probably would have never got the thing going. And lastly, I want to thank my wife, who has been my rock during this whole process. And she sacrificed 3 years of vacation. I went on with her because we're retired, and she had to sit there while all day I was writing this book down in Key Largo. Which was a nice place to write the book, but she also was my initial editor, incredible reader, and without them, all of those people, this book would have never happened. And I plan on sitting down with Charlie and continuing to write about Tri-State, because I think the need for coalitions, and I think the need to expound on what took place back in the 70s and 80s is not only apropos, but is important for young workers to learn about, because we accomplished some stuff that we only accomplished it by using solidarity and by using democracy. And without those two weapons in our arsenal, all is lost. And this last song is called When the Heyday Was Here. And this song is about the entire period of Homestead, going back to the 1892 strike, but just as importantly about what happened in the 1970s and 80s. And I call it the heyday because it was the heyday. It was when thousands of workers were out in the streets demonstrating and fighting for their rights. And that's the kind of movement and the kind of organization we need today.
Thanks a lot, Mike. And thanks to all of you for watching. Go out.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I appreciate it, and I love you all.
Go out and make some democracy.
In the twilight of a moment of a neon time gone, when fire sparks were stars and smoke and dust were the dawn, when the streets were clogged with people and the jobs were plenty. Reckless and abandoned, we were standing brave and tall, mesmerized by the lies that said we'd never fall, and that our plates and our expectations would never be empty. Outside the iron walls of the pewter citadel, marching through the halls, hearts and ranks would swell as we sang about ideas we thought would always be spoken. Standing like a trump card in a game as real as life, running with the vanguard who thought they'd never die, and the spirit and the oneness of our circle could never be broken. And the troughs came together back then, when the bottom rose up to the brim, and the way was so crystal clear. They can never take back what we gave, or cover up the roads that we paved, or bury the history we made when the heyday was here. 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 We were feeling like old, rocking the boats, shaking the foundations unheard. And after every battle, we'd party and laugh, drinking and smoking at the glass. Our camaraderie was more than just words. You know, some say it was a waste of time, that we barely made a dent, that we lost the war when they closed the doors and we were so naive and innocent, and that the wheels of age simply turned the page once again. As I stare out at the ashes of the ruins of the past, back through the clashes before the die was cast, when democracy from below was more than just a means to an end. And though power eluded our reach, when the floor gave way underneath, our pictures might be buried for years. They can never retract what we meant. They can never hide the message we sent, or cover up the history we made. When the heyday was here. 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 When the heyday was here.
People